Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's launch webinar here with HYCU. The focus today is talking about the future of IAM security. And what we're going to talk about is the data protection of Microsoft Entra ID. This is a special launch. Everyone here is going to have a sneak peek into tons of incredible things that HYCU is doing for identity access management as well. Just a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A. Marco and I will make sure to address any question that you have. Please stay till the end and maybe we'll even be able to answer them live. But let's get started. My name is Andy Fernandez. I'm the Senior Director here of Product Marketing. I'm actually calling in from our office here in India. I'm extremely excited to talk about this today. And Marco, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone, from my side as well. My name is Marco. I'm heading our solutions engineering at HYCU.
Thank you so much, Marco. So let's get started. Now, one of the things that I wanted to discuss before we even go into the launch and all of the new capabilities that we have is why are we even having this conversation? What is happening right now in the world that is so critical for us to talk about, from the concept of cloud, the concept of SaaS, and the concept of third-party risk? And if you're ever paying attention to the news these days, at any point in time, you're going to see some form of news listing, some article focused on some of the disruptions and the consequences that we've seen when organizations haven't managed third-party risk effectively. Everyone knows about the elephant in the room with what happened with CrowdStrike, where organizations like Delta lost a significant amount of money, not only in direct downtime and disruption, but also in loss of employee productivity. But this is not just one example. When you think about the organizations all over the world are being affected by their reliance on third parties. Now, this isn't to say that third parties are a risk. What this is saying is if you are not fully aware of your responsibility, there are definite consequences to your organization if you are not managing your third-party risk. And when I say third-party risk, I'm not just talking about a specific cloud platform. I'm talking about your SaaS applications and services across all departments. And what I want to mention here, though, is it's very critical that as we leave this discussion, as we leave this webinar, we take a very good accounting and we take stock of all of our organizations, the services that we rely on. Where is that data? How is it being processed? These are all very critical questions that we have to address. But before we get into it, I'm actually curious for the audience, Marco, to understand exactly how many SaaS applications are really in use in an organization. And the reason I say this is because the research shows that organizations tend to think they have much less SaaS and cloud applications than they actually do. So for the audience and everyone attending, I'd love to hear from your perspective. You can put it on the chat or in the Q&A. How many SaaS applications does your organization have? Now think critically here, not just within IT, within your scope, but across your entire organization. How many as-a-service applications are you leveraging? Now I can tell you for a fact that I leverage many by myself in my own personal work use as well. But Marco, if we think about HYCU, how many SaaS applications are we running at HYCU at this point, Marco, with a couple hundred employees?
Well, what we thought was 20-ish, but I believe it's around 70 plus SaaS applications that we're using currently.
Exactly. Now, if you think about yourselves, especially those who are in mid-sized organizations, we're talking a couple thousand of employees, but all the way up to Fortune 100, we're talking about an average of over 200 SaaS applications. Over 200 SaaS applications in your average mid-sized organization. I already see a couple folks in the audience who've mentioned that they have more than 50. I'm actually happy to see that because it means that you have a very accurate understanding of your organization.
Yep.
There's nothing scarier to me that when there's a CISO, when there's a CIO of a moderately sized organization, they tell me they have 5. They tell me they have 6, 7 applications. What that shows is the purview is within IT and not outside of IT. But the reason that we're asking this is because I wanted to share a couple of the findings of our State of SaaS Resilience report. And what we did here was our organization went out and we worked with an independent organization to survey over 400 IT decision makers, from CIOs to IT managers, directors of IT, even folks within security all over the world. Why? We wanted to really understand the scope of organizations today using SaaS, the risk profile, and to really get an understanding of how these organizations can benefit and they can take responsibility and protect their organization. So what we found was the first thing that, although a little bit shocking, isn't too shocking when you really dig deep, is that out of all of those surveyed, 61% of breaches had SaaS as the source of attack. Now, this sounds a little bit incendiary, but it's not. When you think about all the SaaS applications that we're using, that we really rely on, and I'm not just talking about Microsoft 365 or Salesforce, which on the IT side, you are heavily protecting and you are heavily securing. But what about things like DocuSign or Box or HR software like Workday or Bamboo HR, or even on the NetSuite side? These are all very, very important applications that are no longer hosted on your data center. They live in the cloud. You subscribe to them. Somebody from finance, from marketing, from sales is the administrator of this application. How confident do you feel that they're following security best practices? How many times do we see scenarios where organizations come in simply because there was very little password management in the SaaS application? So it's very interesting to see how organizations not only continue to underestimate how many SaaS applications they're using, but we're still seeing the fact that SaaS is a critical threat. And it's also a high return on investment activity for a hacker. Would you like to go after something that is heavily guarded in an organization? Or would you like to go after something where maybe someone outside of IT is managing? But this is very, very critical to understand. Now, this is very focused and pointed towards today's conversation. And what we found was that organizations found that 75% of them said that their businesses would be meaningfully impacted if their SSO and IAM configurations would become unavailable. And what I mean by that is if all of a sudden somebody deleted their configurations or the vendor made a mistake and there was a supply chain incident, we've seen that already with public cloud vendors that have accidentally deleted data and configurations. Believe it or not, it happens. And over a majority of the folks that we talk to recognize that this is a huge risk to not only the organization, but the business and the health of the business itself. But why is that? And that's why we're going to shift over to our conversation today, which I'm really excited about. And that's about Microsoft Entra ID. Yes, it's called Entra ID. It's no longer Azure AD. But the important piece, and I have to remind myself, Marco, of that every single time, I still, in my heart, refer to it as Azure AD. But
Everybody does.
Entra ID, yeah, exactly. But Entra ID, this is no longer talking about network access or access of a couple applications. Entra ID, these are the keys to the kingdom. Just like Okta, just like other SSOs and IDPs, these are the keys to the kingdom. And what I mean by that? Well, of course, they dictate and measure access control for your SaaS application, for your AD connections on-prem, but also for your contractors, for your partners, for your devices. This is the single piece of software, the single vendor that is connecting to everything in your organization and dictating who can access what. And I don't just mean people accessing software, but I'm even talking about cloud services talking to each other. Entra ID holds the keys to the kingdom. This is the single most important piece of configuration in your organization because it's a very, very, very valuable set of configurations in your organization. Now, maybe you are managing Entra ID yourself, or you have administrators on your team who are dealing with. But let's talk a little bit about the risk to this, because it's very, very important to understand that this is such a critical piece of software that it also makes it a very valuable target for some organizations. So when we think through some of the scenarios, and let's talk a little bit about why we're actually even having this backup conversation around Microsoft Entra ID. You are changing these configurations constantly, whether it's due to onboarding, offboarding, new applications, M&A activity. There's a very, very high change rate in this configuration. And remember, AI hasn't taken over all of us yet. There's still a human who is managing this software. There's still a human who's responsible for the administration, who's responsible for configuration, for cleaning up policies. But because there's such a high change rate, it's very, very easy for human error to hit us all, whether it is a deletion, whether somebody's accidentally cleaned up the wrong policies, or that intern, you've asked them to clean up a couple of configurations. We see examples from our customers all of the time around people accidentally deleting configurations, policies, users, control groups, you name it. The other piece too is whether via automated fashion or somebody has simply misconfigured policies and users, it can be very, very damaging to the organization. And of course, a lot of this can be attributed to poor change management, but the reality is that this happens all of the time. These configurations are critical. There's somebody in your organization or many people responsible for them, bad things can happen. And of course, the worst case scenario too is that, as I just mentioned, Entra ID holds so much critical access that it's a very, very high return on investment for a cyber criminal or a cyber criminal syndicate. We've seen these stories, we've seen the news, we've seen examples of how organizations are actually targeting the administrators themselves via social engineering to gain super administrator access. This presents a massive challenge to your organization. What I want to repeat here is we're not just talking about the worst case scenario where somebody gets access as an administrator to Entra ID or to Okta, but the fact that everyday activities can also lead to disruption, to data loss, if there is human error. And it's not a matter of if, but when, whether it's human error or a cyber criminal event as well.
Do we have a statistics? I mean, we probably don't, but it would be great to have something like this comparing how often do we get contacted because somebody deleted something versus a cyber attack, right? I think the overwhelming ratio is on ourselves making the mistake. And this is what everybody tends to forget.
Yeah, no, 100%, Marco. And one of the things too is this is not simply the world where we're used to, which is virtual machines and databases where usually it's a corruption or a DR scenario. We're talking about hundreds and thousands of permutations of configurations that if only one thing is there's a mistake, then all of a sudden that entire application or the access to that application can go down. I think we should actually start collecting those stats. I don't know what we would call it, but it would be something around screw ups. But it happens all of the time. It happens all of the time, to Mark's point. And the higher the amount of configurations, the higher the change rate, the more likely it is that somebody in your organization is going to make a mistake. So if we kind of look at it, Marco, as a spectrum, what we know for sure that's going to happen all of the time is human error and misconfigurations.
Sure.
What we know will happen at some point, but not as frequent, is some form of exploit, some form of social engineering of the team. And what hopefully never happens, but does happen sometimes, is the vendor themselves dealing with an outage. And all of a sudden there is the deletion of critical data by the vendor themselves, by Microsoft. This can happen too, but it definitely will only happen maybe once in your lifetime, but it can happen. Mistakes, they happen every day. I think I probably delete something every week, Marco. Now, let's talk through a little bit more of what the actual consequences are, right? Whether it's you accidentally modified or changed or deleted your administrator policies or your groups or your users or even something within Azure, what are the consequences of the worst case scenario happen as well? Well, let's grab what happened within MGM as well. This is a very notorious attack. Everyone knows about this. You saw this in the news. You saw this even in mainstream coverage because that's how devastating of an incident it was. And we know the numbers here. We know the big sum of 100 million. But how did they get to that number? So let's say within your organization, ours, or anybody else, you make a huge mistake that allows people to have unauthorized access, or you lose those configurations where the application itself is disrupted, or somebody maliciously gains access. What can happen if you lose your configurations within Entra ID, within Okta, or any other IDP as well? Well, the first thing that happens is there's obviously an impact on revenue, especially if the configurations that you've messed up have any type of impact on end user access to data, end user access to their services and applications. And when there's a disruption of customer experience, there's an immediate impact on revenue. Just how in your organization, from a DR perspective, you calculate, if your VMs go down on tier 1 critical applications, what does that cost the business? It'd be very, very wise to do the same thing with Entra ID, with Okta as well. And of course, it's not just about the customer experience, especially if there's some misconfiguration where it leads to employees not being able to access services. This could be very, very expensive as well. If you think about your organization, even for a day, if your developers cannot access GitHub, if your developers cannot access Jira, if your sales team cannot access Salesforce or your finance team, there are serious costs associated to this that are around productivity. And of course, whether it's through a mistake or some form of social engineering, there's also reputational damage that happens here as well. And the part that I think we never talk about, even in news coverage, even in conversations, it's what happens after the attack? What happens when, whether somebody's paid the ransom or not paid the ransom, what happens then? Well, guess what? You have to go and rebuild all of these configurations. And the larger your organization, the more complex that architecture is, the more complex your policies, your users, and your groups are. And that could take a very, very long time with some of your most dedicated, expensive staff to be able to actually rebuild everything as it was, and make improvements. So these are some of the very, very critical elements that you have to think through when you're making a decision around, well, how am I protecting my Entra ID configurations? How am I protecting my cloud and SaaS workloads as well? But Marko, the gut reaction that I hear all of the time is somebody says, well, isn't this Microsoft's responsibility, Andy? If I send a support ticket, I pay them a lot of money. They should be able to do this for me as well, right? I think, Marko, you probably hear that all the time.
All the time. I'm sure they have many disks, and if something dies, they have another one.
Yeah, exactly.
And
But the reality is, Marko, Microsoft does an amazing job of being very, very transparent with this, extremely transparent. And they follow a shared responsibility model. And if you pay very close attention here to the responsibility model, go to that top section, and it says responsibility is always retained by the customer. For what? Well, for accounts and identities, and for information and data. Why? Because if you make a mistake, which you will at any point in time, Microsoft cannot scale to be able to help you recover across your organization and the 600 million other users that they have. It is not sustainable. So what happens here? They put the onus of responsibility of recovery on your organization. But I'm going to use an example that usually works in this scenario, and it's that of a parking garage. So when you go to a parking garage, what do you expect? Marko's going out to dinner with his wife. They're going into the city, and they want to make sure that they can park. What does Marko expect? He expects to be able to pay for the garage, that his car can go in, that the lights are on, and that when he comes back, he still has a car in that garage. Those are the foundational requirements that he has for that garage. But Marko leaves his window down, and somebody steals his laptop, or they scratch his car, or they hit his car, and Marko doesn't have insurance. Is their garage going to pay Marko? No. In fact, they have signs that says we do not take responsibility or any liability for what happens to your vehicle. It's the same component when it comes to cloud platforms like Microsoft. And they tell you, we're going to maintain the 5 nines of availability. We're going to do our best from a security perspective. If there's an outage, if there's a supply chain issue, we're going to recover everything. In fact, we have backups for that. But if you make a mistake and you delete your configuration that you created, you're going to have to recover that yourself. And this is a very, very important dynamic to understand because it applies to anything that you consume as a SaaS, whether it's GitHub, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Salesforce, Jira, you name it. These are core responsibilities that you have as an organization. Now that we've kind of crossed this hurdle, because this is maybe the most important slide in this whole webinar, even if you are just hearing about HYCU, you have no interest in using HYCU at this point, it's very important that you are aware of your responsibility and take action to do so. But now, what does action look like? What are the options that you have within your organization to be able to actually recover these configurations and take that responsibility at the data level? Let's talk a little bit about this as well. The first option, and this is kind of what I hear from customers all the time before we show them what we're able to do, is, well, Andy, I'll use the recycle bin. Now, this is valuable, and it's Microsoft's responsibility to provide you with some form of recovery options. But here's what happens with the recycle bin. Recycle bin only allows you to recover certain configurations, and it only exists for a couple of days. And another key component here is, unfortunately, people still delete stuff from the recycle bin, and it's gone forever. Now, don't get me wrong. This is an important capability. It's an important feature, but it is not a backup strategy. This is only something for short-term, certain restores, but it doesn't give you the ability to restore several configurations that are very, very critical to your organization. So that's one where, yes, it's nice to use, but if you're looking at a data protection strategy, it's just not going to cut it. Now, the second one I hear all the time is, well, I actually found a Git repo that has an Entra exporter. We can probably script this, schedule some cron jobs, and I think that's going to help. There are a couple limitations here, specifically where this only allows for bulk recovery operations. And there are several limitations when it comes to a recovery perspective that are going to take you a very long time. But even if we step back, just from a foundational perspective, scripts take time, they take energy to create, to schedule, and to tweak. And there's a very, very, very high corruption rate. But Marko, you're probably the best person at scripting that I know. What's been your perspective when customers try to script these things themselves?
This is probably 50 years or 30 years old problem, which doesn't relate only to this technology or Entra or cloud or SaaS. People always, which is a very valid solution. There are intelligent people out there who have the time and resources to invest and develop their own scripts to protect something. And I love these guys. Problem for the companies comes when these guys go, for example, right? Or when they get tired of doing this because it becomes a job, right? And it's not their predominant job. They usually do this on the side and say, yeah, I know this stuff. I'm just going to do it on the side. It's not a process which scales, and especially for things which are as important as Entra ID is something that organizations should really take with caution, right? Using this approach.
100%, Marko. It's, if you have employees devoting hundreds of hours a year to scripting for critical backups, those are hundreds of hours that you could use for so many of your other critical projects that are related to revenue, not to keeping the lights on. But the most important piece here is, out of all backup strategies, out of all the times that you need a recovery to really work, Entra ID sits at the top, along with your tier 1 VMs. That's something that you need to know, that the moment something happens, that you can quickly recover and that you have assurance of that. Scripts, they're fun, they're great, especially if you're a smaller organization. But if you have SLAs, if you have compliance requirements, if you have customers, employees that depend on you, then we highly, highly recommend you think about using a backup solution. And this happens all the time. And actually, customers have taken responsibility. They Googled and they found a backup solution. But here's something to really, really think about with these backup solutions, especially if these are point tools that only focus on Entra ID. The challenge here is that you have to think about where your backups are located. Many of these tools, what they're actually doing, and they offer a great service, it's a great UI, and they say, hey, look, you can assign backups. When you assign that backup and you connect to them, where does the backup go? And I talk to customers about this all the time. And the backup actually goes to that startup or that small company who is now managing the storage and the access to your most critical configurations. You are giving the keys of your kingdom, of your customer and your employee applications to a third party, once again, in order to solve for third-party risk. The goal here is to make sure that you do not increase your risk by having your configurations backed up somewhere accessible to somebody else without you having full control of those backups. So these are some of the options to think about. We acknowledge, though, that the fact that you're already thinking about this is a positive step, that you're actually taking control and performing the backups that you need. That is the most important piece. But of course, there are consequences to finding other alternatives too. And that's what I want to talk about here with Marko. And I'm really, really excited. Most of you know who HYCU is. We're the fastest data protection vendor in the world. And it's been an incredible journey for the last few years of the launch of R-Cloud. One thing that I want to mention here in this evolution of HYCU is everything that we've done from a customer perspective and from an innovation perspective is making sure that we follow the journeys of our customers. We actually started by being able to help organizations protect their most critical infrastructure first, right? How everything used to be highly virtualized applications. And we were able to do so for Nutanix, for VMware, but also follow customer journeys to protecting their compute, their databases, their storage in the cloud. It's still infrastructure, and we made sure that you had the backup, the recovery, the DR components to be able to protect that with HYCU. But then we realized, just like the rest of the world, how prolific SaaS applications were. That anybody with a credit card can spin up a new SaaS application, and if you don't look away, in 4 weeks, it's now a critical application that even has PCI and PII as well. And that's why with our cloud, with our development platform, we have created dozens of integrations to be able to protect your most critical applications, from your repositories with GitHub and GitLab to even productivity and collaboration apps, the Atlassian suite, and so many other critical workloads, from IT to engineering to sales to marketing and to HR. But through this journey, our own realization from our own experience and what our customers taught us too was that, yes, protecting critical infrastructure, a must-have. Protecting SaaS applications, extremely critical. But what about the keys to the kingdom? And throughout the year, we've been extremely proud to see us be able to release the backup and the recovery of Okta, of AWS IAM, and now of Microsoft Entra ID. We are following our customers' journey based on what's most critical to them and most critical to you. And this is why I'm so excited to announce the upcoming support for Microsoft Entra ID from a backup and recovery perspective. Now let's take a step back, because when we think about backup, we've always thought about backup, right, Marco, in the context of I've got my snapshots and my backup copies of my VMs, of my database, maybe at the disk level, I'm good, life is good. That's how we've always thought about backup. But it's not that simple anymore. Life is much more complicated. You used to have a castle. All of your applications lived inside the castle. You controlled access to the castle. Now, your organization still has a data center footprint. You're using cloud, and you're using dozens, if not hundreds, of SaaS applications that you have to protect. The nature and the fundamental reason for backup doesn't go away. It just requires a different technology to be able to do so. And that's why when we say backup and recovery of Microsoft Entra ID, along with Okta, along with everything else, is being able to essentially restore those configurations in a time of need, whether it's human error or whether it's a cyber attack as well. So let's talk about what that actually means. Now, keep in mind, it's your responsibility to back up Entra ID. It's your responsibility to recover. But bulk operations aren't going to help with everything. You need the ability to decide exactly at the level at which you're going to be able to recover. And with HYCU, let's use the example where you actually have detected an insider threat. You think they're screwing around with your policies. You don't know exactly what's going on. This does happen. You want to make sure that you can simply restore your entire tenant back to a safe and valid point in time. And you can do so now with HYCU. But guess what? Like Marco mentioned, yes, this is a threat. We do firmly believe that this happens to every single organization. But what about what happens every single day? There's a cleanup mishap. Somebody's made a mistake. We always use poor Dilbert here. Somebody's made a mistake. What happens then? Are you going to recover everything in your organization to a point in time? Or do you simply want to restore exactly what was deleted, what was corrupted, or what was misconfigured? And that's why with HYCU, you're able to even do a policy level restore. There are so many different specific objects and items that you can restore. Why does this matter? Because it saves you time, and it saves you the ability to simply get back up and running very, very quickly versus performing an entire bulk recovery operation that's going to take you a while. And you can see that right through our UI, just how you're able to restore specific files, how you're able to restore files within an EC2 instance or a table of a database. You can also make sure that from the same UI from R-Cloud, you can also restore your critical Entra ID configurations. By the way, if you are going to join us for the demo in a few minutes, you're going to be able to see how Marco shows you all of the options that you have. We also have a solutions brief for you that you can click the link on, and it gives you all of the recovery capabilities and all of the associated items that happen. This is very, very important because this essentially gives you an undelete button, whether it's because of mistakes that you have to recover or to a serious cyber incident. And I mentioned recovery first because what's the point of backup if you can't recover? But it's also really important to understand how you back up. Remember, a lot of the default options that we see is people try to script this themselves. It takes time, it's error prone, it's very difficult for your organization, and it has a single point of failure. So with HYCU, like how we're able to protect all of your critical infrastructure, we operate on policies. And what I mean by a policy was think of it as an autopilot, where I can say, here's my Entra ID tenant, here are my configurations. I want to do a daily backup, or I want to do a backup every 4 hours. And this is where I want to store it. What happens then? Once you save it, once you assign that to Entra ID, that's 24/7. That is what we call a set and forget policy that is there and available to you, always working. No scripts, no scheduling. It is a one-click assignment of a policy that makes sure that it works in perpetuity. You have backup assurance from HYCU on doing so. But a core value add here is you get to choose how often you want to do those backups. You choose the data frequency. Not every application is the same. Entra ID, it's not a lot of data, but it's very, very important data. You might want to take very frequent backups. And of course, you can store copies for a defined amount of time. And you always have notifications, and you have logging available here. Who has accessed this? What operation was conducted? You always have that available. If HYCU is doing its job, if you are trusting HYCU, it means that you're actually using HYCU for a minute of the week, and you always have the notifications that you need, that your backup is working, and that your organization is compliant. The difference between this and scripting is hundreds, if not thousands of hours of both building and scheduling these scripts, but also of recovery and bulk recovery operations as well. But apart from recovery, the most important question, Marko, is always, well, okay, are you storing this? Where's my data going? Where's that compute running? Like, who has access to the keys to my kingdom? And that's why with HYCU, one of the most important things about us and a true differentiator is you can think of us as an encrypted highway from your application to a storage location that only you can control. And what I mean by this is that HYCU is not storing the backups for you. HYCU is sending these backups to a storage bucket of your choice, whether that's AWS, whether that's Azure, Google Cloud, or even S3 compatible storage like Wasabi. All of those critical configurations, whether it's Entra ID, whether it's GitHub, whether it's your cloud applications, they are stored in your bucket. And what does that mean? Well, it means you get to choose where it resides. You get to control the access. You control the storage tiers. You get to enable immutability of these copies as well. And you get to make sure you have full control of that data. By the way, that data can be completely outside of Microsoft. So you can have Entra ID backups that are copied and stored in AWS or in Google Cloud. We've seen examples where organizations had all of their data deleted by the public cloud vendor. The only reason they got it back was because they had backups in another cloud. You have the options to do this, and it's something that we highly recommend for something so critical like Entra ID as well. But there are a couple of core principles that we have here as well, because we always pride ourselves in our approach to security and to be able to service enterprise organizations. I think, Marko, with all this new technology, with cloud native infrastructure, we're constantly wowed, we're constantly learning that we forget the fundamentals. And that's the 3-2-1 rule. We forget the fundamentals because we get excited, and then something bad happens and people realize, oh, that rule still applies. And with HYCU, one thing that we always strive for is that you always have a copy of your data completely offsite and in your control. And that copy has to be accessible if there is a true cyber incident, that you know that there's a safe offsite copy available to you. By the way, HYCU also runs outside of Microsoft. You have the ability to make sure that you have a backup service that's always running independently, giving you independent copies. And when you think about what HYCU is able to do that most organizations cannot do, is actually help you meet and define and be flexible around how often you want to take these backups. The data is always stored in your control. You have complete freedom as how you want to store it, where you want to store it, and for how long. But the most important piece here is you're not looking at a point solution where I now have a backup for Entra ID, along with my backup for Microsoft 365, along for my backup for Salesforce, for VMs, for my cloud instances, for Jira. You want to avoid additional data silos and third-party risk. You want to consolidate all backups to one vendor, stored with the data in your control. And of course, you get to work with a Gartner recognized platform with an NPS of 91. This is my favorite fact about working here at HYCU, our focus and obsession with customer success. But guess what? That's a lot of information. There's nothing better than for Marko to actually show you how this works, what that R-Cloud experience is, and how we're able to help our customers stay resilient at all point in time. So Marko, I'm going to hand over the keys to you.
Thank you, Andy. All right, let me share the screen. And use the next 10 minutes or so. You can see it? All right. So let me use the next 10 minutes or so to actually show you HYCU in action and what the HYCU R-Cloud platform looks like. So it's a service, technically. You don't need to deploy, install, size, think about anything. You simply subscribe, same as you would to any other service. And as you can see, you can log in with Microsoft. Obviously, if Entra ID is down, you could log in with HYCU managed credentials as well, or an Okta managed credentials, or any of the other identity providers. And as you can see, you are already here at HYCU dashboard. And the first thing which I want to show you is really the HYCU marketplace. So HYCU is really a platform. So we have managed to develop over 50 or 100 SaaS application backups in the last year or so, not by ourselves, but by the ability and the knowledge of other partners who develop on top of our platform and add these modules, these backup modules for SaaS applications on our marketplace, right? So I love to scroll through this because it allows you to see, I have this app, I forgot about this one, right? What Andy was mentioning at the beginning, where we think we just use a couple of them. Scrolling down this type of marketplace actually triggers a lot of light bulbs in the brain. I have this, I should back up this as well. And if we look at here, if we focus for example, on identity and security, you can see already how HYCU is covering the Okta CIC and VIC and a number of AWS, IAM, and key management service, very important applications as well as others. And here, what we are now adding, obviously, is Azure, and this is what we're really proud and happy about. Also, what happens when you add HYCU, we have something called Discover services, right? So this allows us to use your Okta and your Entra ID to actually show you what kind of applications you're running in your environment. We show you this in the form of rGraph, which is actually a free tool coming with HYCU, which you can subscribe to immediately. And this will, through your Entra ID, show you and discover what kind of applications you're using in your environment. And it will demonstrate to you in a very seamless and nice way what you can, what you're actually protecting, what you're not protecting, what kind of applications have built-in type of protection, right? For example, here Dropbox has self-service restore, which is quite unusual for SaaS applications, but they can't actually perform backup on your own or have it somewhere else, keep data in your premises and so on. So this type of rGraph application, which is free again, is going to allow you to have visual over your complete estate, compartmentalize the whole thing. So you can say, this is my sales and marketing, this is my engineering applications, these are my HR applications, learning apps, right? So everything in a single spot so that you can actually show to your business what is not protected. And a lot of times with SaaS applications, a lot of is actually not protected. Now, that being said, let's look at how HYCU policies look like. So what is it that we're actually backing up, right? Or how does this business of not scripting, but actually having it fully automated looks like? So you just have concept of HYCU policies, which allow you to have a backup every 12 hours on a specified storage target. You can have a secondary copy and an archive as well for long-term retention. And you can have these in different storage locations, right? So this is all from a single place where you define a policy, define rules of your backup, which are linked to what your business mandates with your SLAs, and you assign it to any of your SaaS applications which you have in your environment, which you add, which we auto-discover. As well as not only this, right? You can assign these policies also to the Google and AWS, Azure instances, buckets, applications, everything we find in a single place as part of our cloud. And most importantly, where is this data being backed up at the end of the day, right? And this is where you can see, if I switch to my other protection set here, you can see that this is not only Google or Azure, right, or Amazon. This is really a multi-cloud solution, a multi-cloud platform, which allows you to back up your Entra ID into different public clouds. And when you're adding a storage, it's going to actually add and ask you for a different service account, right? So you can really have a dedicated service account for each of these storage. So really have that air gapness, isolation, and on top of this, worm or immutability is part of the product. So we'll automatically discover all of the object lock enabled buckets and targets and use this natively inside the product, which is a very important concept when it comes to ransomware protection, right? And before we jump into Entra ID, one of the last things which I want to show you is how do you access HYCU in the first place. First of all, you can have many HYCUs in a single HYCU. We call this protection set, which allows you as a company to have different segments of your organization. You can say HR, engineering, sales is going to have different concepts, different policies, different HYCUs to protect their environments, different storage is going to be used. So you can really compartmentalize this. And also, when you add users into HYCU, which can log into HYCU, you have role-based access. So you can actually control what each of these users can do when they log into HYCU, allowing you to allow self-service recovery also to the end users as well. So this all a lot of applies to the complete system. And when talking about SaaS applications, let's now dive into Entra ID and what this means to add Entra ID and how do we protect it and what can we restore in the first place. So very simple to add an Entra ID. What you would do is simply add it as a module into HYCU. We call these R-Cloud modules. And to add it, the only thing which you would need to do is provide a tenant ID and the ID, client ID and secret, which is a password, and that's it. From there on, HYCU under SaaS application is going to recognize and discover your Entra ID application. And in similar fashion, it's going to, in the same place, you can discover your Okta application, IAM. You can do AWS IAM. So the complete portfolio can be, everything can be in a single spot if you want, and go to the same storage. So really not have that compartmentalization. You know, I'm using this app for that, I'm using that app for the other one, and so on, right? You can really have a single place for your data protection on all of the SaaS applications. And when you're backing up Entra, right? Let's say backing up is always easy. What you want to do is be able to restore, right? And how does this look like in HYCU? Really, this is what the beauty is. In a lot of cases, this thing, restoring a full tenant, is going to be rarely used and hopefully never, right? But you really need to have this option. But what most often is going to happen is that you really, by a mishap, by that guy who deletes stuff, you're going to be able to, you're going to need to restore something granularly. And this is where I lost the user, I lost an application registration. Maybe I was doing something, I misconfigured something, or a role, right? Or an enterprise app. All of these things, which are very important, that can, but you add it on daily basis, are actually something that you can, a mishap can happen. And this is what you really need to be able to granularly restore. Otherwise, if you need to restore a whole tenant to get it, you will not restore it, which means you'll need to redo it yourself or fix it. And this causes time lag and, at the end of the day, cost, right? So what happens when I click restore here is that HYCU is able to scale immensely. What does this mean? If I have Entra ID and Okta now, and I decide to add 100 more of my SaaS application, there is nothing I need to do from the HYCU as a platform perspective. Why? Because for every job that HYCU runs, we actually trigger a small worker which does the job. At the end, we remove it. So there is no sizing, proxies, things you need to think about, networking, nothing like this, right? HYCU does all the job for you. We trigger this VM, which is going to actually perform the backup and restore jobs. And at the end, we remove it. And this is exactly what's happening now. We are powering it on. It's going to read the catalog of the data. So we catalog everything that we backed up on Entra ID so that you can easily browse through it and select the user which you misconfigured or lost. And you're able to then perform restore of that particular user.
Marko, one thing to mention here too is sometimes people would think when they think deletion, they think, oh, if I deleted a single user, I can just go and recreate that single user. But what folks don't realize sometimes is so many of these deletion incidents happen in bulk. They happen across all users, or they can happen across all of your applications or plugins. So what people really need to think through here is, after deleting one user, that's fine. Any of us can recreate that. But when you do deletions in bulk, that means you have to rebuild this across your organization. And that's a really, really critical component to understand here when it comes about recovery.
Yep. And not only that, I mean, if you might have deleted that particular user from a set of roles or from a group or from God knows where exactly, right? So what happens when you say, I want to restore these 3 users from HYCU, and you can see here that you can actually restore, select where do you want to restore it from the immediate backup target which you used, or if you had a snapshot, or if you had a secondary copy or an archive in another cloud, you can select this here to control where the data comes from. And when you restore it, HYCU is going to make sure to cover all of these things, right? So if a user still exists, we're not going to override the user, we're just going to restore the things which were deleted, right? We're going to relink it to the role in which it was added, or the group, it's going to be re-added into that group. Or if it's completely deleted, we're going to recreate a user and add it back, right? And this is the beauty of it, which allows you to truly granularly recover the whole environment and save you time and resources. And again, what you saw here for Entra ID applies very much to any other IAM, as you can see here for Okta, or any other SaaS application as well. This is really the beauty of the whole solution, to allow you granular recovery of any SaaS application. I think we are running on time, but we are sending you more material on this, and obviously this is going to be GA very, very soon. This was a sneak peek for you. I hope you liked it. And please feel free to subscribe and dive into it, right?
Absolutely. Marko, can you see my screen? I just wanted to
Yes.
confirm. Perfect. No, Marko, thank you so much. And one of the things that I want to mention here too is third-party risk is very real. And it's as important in Entra ID as it is in Okta. A lot of folks think these folks are competitors, but the reality is that many of you and other organizations are using Okta, Entra ID, and other SSOs together. Whether it's because of new application types, whether it's because of M&A, you want to make sure that you can protect both of them as well. Now, what I wanted to mention here too, though, is HYCU has the broadest coverage of data protection for now coming up Entra ID, for Okta, not only Workforce Identity Cloud, but Customer Identity Cloud, but also even for your Cloud IAM. What happens if you delete your policies in AWS IAM? What happens if your EC2 instances can't communicate with other parts of your infrastructure? I mean, the same consequences happen. But as we've talked about, the world of backup and the requirements of a backup vendor for data protection are way beyond just being able to protect VMs, to be able to protect databases and storage, but also configurations across the organization. And that's why at HYCU, I'm so proud that we're also able to do this across the board. Let's take AWS as an example. What happens if somebody deletes a DHCL setting or a configuration? Then that means that it's a very important one, by the way. You have to go and recreate it or restore from a bulk operation. With HYCU, you can back up and restore in the same fashion Amazon VPC, Route 53, WAF, parameter store, and also even multiple region keys as well in KMS. This is very, very critical because this is no longer simply about access management. This is no longer the days of just managing your networking firewall on-prem. These are decoupled services that only talk to each other via configuration. If you lose those configurations, you introduce risk, you introduce unauthorized access, but you can also even completely disrupt your applications. So Marko and I, we've talked a lot today. There's so much more to discuss, but there's 5 key takeaways. And before I get into these takeaways, I think my takeaway, Marko, is that we only said Azure AD twice. So I think that's pretty good. I was expecting we'd say that 10 to 15 times, but we only called it Azure AD twice. So I'm pretty proud of that. But ignore and don't ignore, but think through. It's critical that you see how HYCU is able to innovate. But even beyond that, just think about your data protection strategy, your organization. Here are 5 fundamental takeaways to take through, completely separate from HYCU. The first one is acknowledge the responsibility that you have for SaaS recovery, from Entra ID to other critical applications in your tech stack. At minimum, you should be performing daily backups of these configurations. Be very careful where that data is stored. One other example is if I'm taking exports to my PC of Entra ID, am I all of a sudden downloaded unencrypted configurations to a single device that I can leave at my desk and I cannot make it to work next day when they need that backup? It's very important to understand how and where that data is stored. Can the solution and can your backup strategy help you protect both Entra ID and Okta? Can it help scale to protect your cloud identity access management like AWS? And you have to make sure that not only are you protecting the keys to the kingdom, but the actual jewels themselves, the critical applications that keep your business running, from GitHub and Jira for your developers to your M365, Google Workspace, you name it. So with that, something that I want to mention here is this is going to be available in the HYCU Marketplace next week. You can sign in, we can give you an early demo, you can take a look exactly how it works, and then you can even get a free trial. And you can register for that free trial by scanning this QR code. But if you want to simply take in more information, understand all of the recovery options, all of the associated items that are recovered, how HYCU is special, what are the things that you're able to do with HYCU across not only Entra ID, but everything else, we have a full solutions brief for you to be able to read through that material as well. So with that, I want to make sure that we address a couple of the critical questions. By the way, if you have any questions, and we don't get to answer them because I know we're already coming up with a minute left on this webinar, we will personally email you with a full breakdown, a full answer. Marko and I will do that ourselves. So one of the things that I'm seeing here is, what about licensing and costs? This is all going to be licensed per user, and it'll be the same cost as licensing Okta, Entra ID, and AWS IAM as well, and we'll send you that information on the cost as well. And this obviously works the same way across all other applications that you're protecting with HYCU and with R-Cloud as well. Marko, quick question here. Some folks are also asking about, does HYCU have any scale restrictions? If I have many applications, I have a lot of capacity, a lot of critical databases, not just Entra ID that I want to protect. Are there any limitations with HYCU, or can I just protect anything that I need?
Anything that you need, always.
Perfect. I see a couple more questions on here, and the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that Marko and I answer them right after this webinar. So I want to thank everybody for your time, for your attention. We're extremely excited about this. I'm glad you've given us, 40 minutes of this time to go over this. I'm very happy to have this discussion with you further and show you exactly how HYCU can protect your organization. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.